Hello and welcome to Language, Culture, and Dr. Lou. And today I want to, react to this article I found about whether the province of Alberta is going to secede from Canada. Well, the topic of the article is about how some people in Alberta are wanting to secede from Canada. And this to me is really interesting because it's been 30 years since any province of Canada has ever voted on whether they wanted to secede or not. That was the province of Quebec, and that's the only province that has ever voted on whether they wanted to secede or not. Just the one, and so this now makes two. But speaking of Quebec, they actually had two referenda on whether they wanted to secede from Canada or not. The first one is in 1980, and that one, they did not even get all that close to seceding in the sense that the votes on the referendum were 60% were against seceding and only 40% were for it. So they didn't even come close to getting a majority on that one. Now in 1995, it got a little more interesting because they almost got to a majority because it was almost a 50-50 split in the votes. I think the actual numbers were the people who wanted to secede represented 49.42% of the vote. So almost 50%, but still rounding down to 49. And the people who did not want to secede were only 50 point, I think 50.52% or something like that. So it was just barely over 1% difference. And so the bare majority wanted to stay in. And so that whole thing got shut down. And that to me is kind of funny because so far they had done one, well, in 1980, then 15 years later in 1995. I always wondered, well, at the time in the late 90s and early 2000s, I was wondering if they would do another one in 2010 and then, actually manage to get a majority and secede. I don't know. But one thing, yeah, that's noteworthy about Alberta wanting to separate now because Quebec is kind of understandable because they're much more French than any other province. They're much more French speaking and all that. But Alberta is a different story. So, Alberta, just to look at a little map, we'll get outside of the article and look at a little map to see where is Alberta? So there's a map of the US and Canada. Well, there's a little bit of northern Mexico in there too, but just to give you an idea, if you're not Canadian, I thought this might be necessary. And by the way, the article is from the Calgary Herald, which again, Calgary is one of the two most notable cities in Alberta. So that's uh, why I'm going right to Alberta to get this news. And Alberta, as you can see on this map, is the Canadian province in yellow right here. And so that is a pretty large chunk of Canada that would secede if they leave it, right? Not as big as Quebec, but still really big chunk. And as you can see here, Alberta on this map looks like it's even bigger than Texas, the bit in the purple there. And so that is interesting to me. That's a huge amount of land for Canada to lose. And speaking of Texas, that's one thing that's particular about the culture in Alberta, or at least how people think of the culture in Alberta, is it's very much cowboy culture and rodeo country, that kind of a deal. Like, a lot of people think of Alberta as kind of like the Texas of Canada, and so, as you can imagine, they vote much more conservatively on the whole than a lot of Canada does. Although Texas is becoming a little more purple with so many people leaving California and moving there, but still, Alberta is pretty conservative in how it votes. And I think this is all part of what brings us to why Alberta want to secede is because you know how Canada just had a big federal election where they elected the PMs for the House of Commons. And so the House of Commons is to Canada as the House of Representatives is to the US. So same kind of deal. And PMs are like they're the same as congressional representatives would be in the US. And how the choosing of the Canadian Prime Minister works is the leader of the party that holds the most seats of all in the House of Commons is the Prime Minister of Canada. And so that's why I think Alberta is pretty pissed off from the results of the last election because um, the Mark Carney maintained his status as Prime Minister of Canada because the um, Liberal Party maintained the most seats in the House of Commons. So they're liberals. And this is now the fourth administration in a row that's been the Liberal Party in charge of everything. So as you can imagine, Albertans are pretty pissed off about that. And the reason that the Liberal Party won this time, in my opinion, because they were looking kind of politically dead in the water uh, just a few months ago, even. And especially their leader, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, was looking politically pretty dead in the water himself. And then he stepped down as the leader of the Liberal Party, which made and they voted to have Mark Carney become the leader of the Liberal Party, which then made him Prime Minister of Canada. But they were about to have more elections in just like 5 or 6 weeks after that, so he had to run out again. And the reason why the Liberals won and that Mark Carney won, in my opinion, is because political winds changed in Canada a lot when Donald Trump started menacing them by saying, "Oh, they should be the 51st state," and then with all these ridiculous tariffs that all of a sudden went into place, then all of a sudden the Liberal Party started having the political messaging of vote Canada strong and yeah, mainly Mark Carney became a big enemy to Donald Trump. And and Donald Trump himself, when Mark Carney was in DC, when he was meeting with Trump in the White House, Donald Trump admitted that he probably helped Mark Carney win that election because Canada hates Donald Trump enough to, to vote for whoever is willing to stand up against him. And because the second strongest party and the second strongest candidate for prime minister was the Conservative Party and Poilievre. And so Donald Trump endorsed Poilievre, which pretty much shot down his chances of winning. And so that was good for Mark Carney. Even Donald Trump recognizes this. So, in my opinion, Donald Trump, in a roundabout way, is somewhat responsible for Alberta wanting to secede Canada, but it's a few steps to take there anyway. And so the message is not nowhere in this article will you see any message about Alberta wanting to become the 51st state, right? They're just talking about seceding from Canada to become their own uh, sovereign nation. And so let's look at the ballot question. Oh, and like I said, how Alberta is kind of the Texas of Canada. The lawyer, Jeff Rath, with the Alberta Prosperity Project. That's the group of separatists. Um, he's wearing a cowboy hat right here. And so the question on the ballot is, do you agree that the province of Alberta shall become a sovereign country and cease to be a province of Canada? Yes or no? It's a very straightforward question. And so, again, here's the same question in bigger font. And then what Jeff Rath said, he was talking pretty tough there when he's like, "Oh, it's not a wishy-washy question like what they had in Quebec." So now he's picking on the Quebecois for their referendum question 30 years ago. But yeah, he's playing tough, I guess. And by the way, like I said, in the province of Quebec, 1995 referendum was pretty much 50-50. So they nearly did secede from Canada. And what's noteworthy is that in 1999, a few years later, the Canadian federal government made the Clarification Act, or no, the Clarity Act, which sort of said that, well, it made it a little harder for provinces to secede from Canada. And I'll get into a little bit more about that later but it's relevant because Alberta would be fighting an even higher uphill battle of leaving Canada than Quebec did. Um, just thought that was relevant. Anyway, and so the question of Alberta's separatism recently came back into the forefront of social debate after Premier Danielle Smith tabled legislation in late April to reduce the threshold for a petition to trigger a referendum. So, Danielle Smith, those who don't know about Canadian politics, a premier is to a Canadian province the same way a governor is to a state in the United States. So the premier, that's pretty much like their governor for that province. So Alberta's premier, Danielle Smith, she tabled the legislation that people put forward. And that means she's not really helping them out. To table something, that's to set it aside or delay it for further discussion and debate. So she's not really doing them any favors here. But if the legislation were still uh, active, if it passed, it might actually significantly reduce the number of signatures that the group would need to get the referendum on the ballot. And it would also give them a lot more time to collect the signatures. So that piece of legislation that their premier just tabled, that would have helped them out a whole lot. So that makes me think, yeah, she's looking to save herself politically a little more than she's looking for to help the separatists anyway. And so the thing is, though, as you can see in the highlighted portion at the bottom of the page, this group has already gotten more than half of the amount of signatures that they would need to put the referendum on the ballot. Um, but they did not get the extension on time that they were hoping to get. So we'll see if they can do it. And Jeff Rath again, speaking again, the Canadian lawyer in the cowboy hat we saw in the picture earlier. He said, but our goal is to get 600,000 pledges to not just get the referendum, but to win the referendum, right? And so that would be interesting if they could do that and how they plan on making that happen. They're planning on holding 50 town halls across the province of Alberta. And they're considering this a so-called educational campaign on the rationale and merit of Alberta's sovereignty. So they're trying to convince people it would be a good idea to leave the so-called education, yeah, getting people to agree with your point of view is what they mean about that. And heck, if they do hold that many town halls, maybe they can get there because right now the polling numbers are saying that they're really in a minority. And yeah, and a poll number, well, in the Times Union article about the same topic, a Times Magazine article, sorry, a Times Magazine article about the same topic that came out not too long ago. By the way, this article here just came out on Monday, May 12th, 2025. And the Times Union article mentioned only 10% of Albertans polled wanted to leave the Union. I mean, to leave Canada, wanted to secede from Canada. But I looked more into that poll, and it turns out, yeah, 10% they fully, wholeheartedly agreed with the idea that Alberta should secede, or should at least vote to secede. And but if you add in too the number of people who said they somewhat agree with the idea that they should vote on whether to secede, that brings that total number up to 25%. I think about a quarter of the people polled would either somewhat or fully agree that they should hold that referendum. So I'm not sure they're ever going to get to the majority of voters that they need. But heck, um, if this so-called education campaign goes well for them, maybe political winds can change, and give it a few months, and they might get there. Although right now, not looking very likely. And Rath goes on saying, "We intend to knock on every door at least twice," saying that if the group were educated, if they educated Albertans on real issues, the province would vote for independence, right? Well, yeah, again, I think their education campaign is just trying to get people to agree with them, and that's a little more different than just if they spill out all the facts, then people will automatically agree with them. But still, so again, I'm not thinking their chances very good, but still very possible. And so this group, they painted a vision of Alberta as an independent nation with no regulations from Ottawa, which, by the way, Ottawa is the capital of Canada, and no obligations to Eastern Ottawa. They would have lower provincial taxes and zero federal taxes. To me, that's kind of funny because um, if they're gonna stop being a province of Canada and start being their own nation, wouldn't that make their taxes federal? Unless they're planning on dividing them up into a bunch of provinces. I don't know. I'm not really understanding that, well, that wording very well, but and so they're thinking if they lower the taxes for everybody, then all of a sudden, an independent Alberta would see a lot of oil and gas development, right? Drill, baby, drill, and they would see a free market trade agreement with the U.S. And to me, that's a big if. The American administration isn't really playing nice when it comes to trade agreements lately. So I don't know. That's a huge if, in my opinion. So if they had the oil and gas development double within 5 years and had a free market trade agreement with the US and a flat 10% income tax and a flat 10% corporate tax, while being able to keep their Canadian passports and Canadian pension plan entitlements, that all sounds very good, but I don't see how you do that, how you separate from the country of Canada, but still maintain your Canadian passports. I don't think they're thinking this through completely fully anyway. And then he goes on to say we'd be the lowest tax regime in North America, and we wouldn't want, I mean, who wouldn't want to locate their corporate headquarters in Edmonton or Calgary with a flat 10% corporate tax rate and a flat 10% income tax rate? We think that we have a robust economic message to sell. Yeah, it sounds like they're thinking about bringing in big business that way. Um, so that sounds like they do have a fairly convincing argument to make anyway. And they do plan to push, if they do get the number of signatures they need, they really plan to push their premier, Danielle Smith, to hold a referendum this year. Now, someone from this group said that the premier told him in a call last week that she plans to give Ottawa 6 months before holding a referendum. So again, their premier is not really doing them any favors here. She's sort of gumming up the works, but we'll get to why she wants Ottawa to have 6 more months a little later. But so he says that she owes it to Alberta to give it 6 months, and after that, if she doesn't come over to our side, then we're going to have a problem. He said, adding that if she decides against the referendum vote, she would be acting contrarily to the desires of the electoral base. So he's already saying this. And yeah, if they do get enough signatures, I don't see why they shouldn't get the referendum. But the premier does have some purview over that. Anyway, so in this, this is the end of the article, but this is important. That's why it's all highlighted. And so since the federal election, Premier Smith has made a number of demands of Prime Minister Mark Carney, ranging from dropping federal energy and climate policies. Again, this would push the whole drill baby drill thing for Alberta. So she's been asking Mark Carney to drop the federal energy and climate policies and been asking him to change the federal transfer system within the next 6 months so Alberta gets more money from Ottawa. So she's trying to push big business and more money for Ottawa in the federal level. Um, so I think that maybe that's why she's not seeing it completely necessary to just secede altogether. She thinks she can get what she wants out of the federal government there. But Alberta's won't be moved by whatever little box of chocolates Mark Carney can bring to the table. The lawyer in the cowboy hat from earlier said. And so the citizens can decide which is more valuable to them, the box of chocolates from Carney or a country without federal regulation or federal taxes. They can decide what is more valuable to them. And this does sound like he's being kind of Texas, kind of Wild Westy with the whole no federal regulations or federal taxes or anything like that. Um, Yeah, that's sort of sounding a little Texasy to me, being that Texas was the well, is considered the Lone Star State and all that. But so that's a lot of their message. Basically, a bunch of um, conservative citizens in Alberta, which is normal. There's lots of conservatives there. A lot of very conservative citizens want to push for to have a referendum as soon as sometime this year to vote on whether they will secede from Canada or not. And for me, I think that maybe the referendum will happen if they already have more than half of the signatures that they need. Although the government's not giving them an extension on the timeline to get the rest. But if they're having town halls across the province, I bet they're going to gather their signatures there and all that. But if they do have that referendum, so far I'm highly doubting they would even get a majority of the votes because, like I said, right now only a quarter of the registered voters polled would be either partially or completely favorable to having that referendum anyway. So the political headwinds would have to change quite a bit between now and the referendum for them to even get a majority. And like I said earlier, after Quebec did their, and by the way, this is not part of the article anymore. We're now something else noteworthy. What I mentioned earlier was in 1999, Canada made the Clarity Act, which kind of makes it even a little harder for a province to secede from it. So they need the referendum, not just to be a simple majority, right? Not just to be 50 point something percent or 51%. They need it to be a clear expression of a will by a clear majority of the provincial population. What that Patriot Act does not do is it does not give a specific percent threshold of what they consider a clear majority, right? And I think that was on purpose because this all means that the House of Commons, again, the federal government, gets to determine if the referendum does indeed demonstrate a strong enough majority for separation, right? So even if they vote within the province, then it becomes up to the representatives in the federal government to decide whether that referendum that got some majority is even valid enough because it's a clear enough majority to secede. So that just getting a slight majority on the referendum is not a guarantee that you'll be allowed to secede. And there's a few other things, like for instance, you need this would take a an amendment to the Canadian Constitution and all that. But anyway, so the last paragraph written there says, in essence, well, a province can hold a referendum to secede. It's not a straightforward, the process is not straightforward and involves a constitutional amendment, a determination by the House of Commons on whether the referendum actually demonstrates a clear majority. And then after all that, there are mandatory negotiations that would have to happen within government. So my prediction is that even is that Alberta may or may not hold the referendum, although I think it's kind of likely that they will get their referendum, at least on the ballot. I doubt they will get a majority. And then even if they do get a majority, I doubt the Canadian government will consider it a clear majority and even let them go. But anyway, like I said, if the premier gets a wish and gets a good 6 months to go by between now and the referendum, um, then maybe enough Albertans could be convinced and they could end up with a clear majority. So I'm not sure if the premier is playing this right or playing it foolishly by extending 6 months to the deal, but we'll see. And so that's it on this story for now. But if there are any more developments, I will definitely bring them to this channel. And yeah, so yeah, now I will go and make another video on something that's not political at all. I promise you. And so until then, see you around next time. Bye bye.